December 15, 1944. The snow-laden forests of the Ardennes, Belgium. Obersturmbannführer Werner Schroeder stood atop a ridge overlooking the American supply routes, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he lowered his binoculars. The temperature had plummeted to -7 degrees Celsius, and forecasts promised the worst winter in decades. Behind him, seasoned Wehrmacht officers nodded in agreement as he spoke. "We'll freeze Patton's army in the snow," Schroeder boasted, gesturing toward the American positions barely visible through the swirling flakes. "The Americans cannot fight both us and General Winter. Their supplies will never reach the front in these conditions." Little did he know that within 72 hours, the rumble of hundreds of GMC CSKW trucks, the famed Red Ball Express, would shatter both the silence of the forest and the certainty of German victory. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how America's logistical might, personified by the tireless drivers of the Red Ball Express, would transform the Western Front in ways that German military doctrine had never anticipated, forcing soldiers like Schroeder to confront the uncomfortable truth that industrial capacity, not just tactical brilliance, determines modern warfare's outcome. The German offensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge had begun with stunning initial success. Hitler had amassed 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces for his last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces. The meticulously planned Ardennes offensive caught the Americans by surprise, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines. Major General Troy Middleton of the U.S. 8th Corps had only 68,822 men in 4 divisions facing the onslaught. Many were inexperienced replacements or battle-weary veterans who had been sent to this quiet sector to recover. Within the first 24 hours, German forces had punched through American defenses, overrunning entire battalions and creating panic among Allied commanders. Schroeder, a veteran of the Eastern Front, commanded a battle group of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Having survived 3 Russian winters, he knew intimately how logistics could crumble in severe weather. "The Americans are soft," he told Sturmbannführer Klaus Helmuth as they reviewed their maps inside a commandeered Belgian farmhouse. "Their trucks will bog down in this snow. Their supply lines will stretch and snap. And then," he smiled coldly, "we cut them to pieces." Helmuth nodded, though with less certainty. He had fought against the Americans since Normandy. "Their material advantage is considerable," Herr Obersturmbannführer. "I've never seen so many vehicles, so much fuel, so much ammunition." Numbers on paper, Schroeder dismissed with a wave. "What good are 10,000 trucks if they cannot move? Our panzers are superior machines. Our men are hardened veterans. And now," he tapped the weather report, "we have General Winter as our ally." 500 miles away in the Pentagon, Colonel John S. D. Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied Commander, was coordinating with Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone, European Theater of Operations. The logistics situation was deteriorating rapidly as reports of the German breakthrough flooded in. "We need to reactivate the Red Ball Express at full capacity," Eisenhower stated, referring to the truck convoy system that had been gradually phased out since November when the Allies secured the port at Antwerp. "General Patton's Third Army needs to pivot 90 degrees and attack the southern flank of the Bulge immediately." Lee studied the situation map, calculating requirements. "That's a 125-mile route through terrain that's now buried under 18 inches of snow, with more falling hourly. We're talking about moving an entire army's worth of supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, in the worst winter conditions in decades. Can it be done?" Eisenhower asked simply. Lee didn't hesitate. "It must be done. I'll have 6,000 trucks on the road within 48 hours. What neither man mentioned aloud was the composition of the drivers who would make up the revived Red Ball Express. Of the 23,000 truck drivers who would ultimately participate, over 70% would be African-American soldiers. In the segregated U.S. Army of 1944, black soldiers were often assigned to service and supply units rather than combat roles, despite their desire to fight. Now, the fate of the Allied counteroffensive, perhaps the entire Western Front, would rest on their shoulders. Technical Sergeant William Thompson of the 3908th Quartermaster Truck Company had been catching rare sleep in a temporary barracks near Reims when the orders came through. A tall man from Detroit who had worked on automotive assembly lines before the war, Thompson had been driving Red Ball routes since the breakout from Normandy. Everybody up. Full alert. All drivers report immediately. The sergeant major's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. Thompson was on his feet instantly, years of Army discipline taking over. Around him, his fellow drivers, Johnson, Miller, Wallace, and the others, were pulling on uniforms and boots. "What's the situation, Sarge?" asked Corporal Marcus Johnson, a former taxi driver from Harlem who could navigate the winding European roads like he'd been born to them. Germans broke through in the Ardennes. Entire fronts in chaos. "We're rolling in 30 minutes, Thompson replied, already mentally calculating fuel consumption rates for winter conditions. Outside, the motor pool was transforming from sleepy to frantic. Mechanics were performing hasty maintenance checks on hundreds of GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the workhorse of the American supply system. These six-wheeled vehicles, nicknamed Jimmy or Deuce and a Half by their drivers, normally carried 2.5 tons of cargo. Today they would carry 3 tons or more. Each truck's specifications were well known to its driver. Powered by a GMC 270 cubic inch engine generating 104 horsepower, with a 5-speed transmission and a 2-speed transfer case. In good conditions, they could maintain 45 miles per hour on highways. In Belgian winter conditions, they'd be lucky to average 15. Check your chains, check your antifreeze, and load double rations and blankets. Thompson instructed his men as they performed their pre-departure checks. This run is going to be different. We'll be moving round the clock in weather that would make the devil wear a coat. By 0600 hours, the first convoys were rolling. The Red Ball Express, named after the red balls painted on the trucks to identify them as priority vehicles, was officially reactivated. The system was simple but effective. Trucks would travel in convoys at 60-yard intervals, moving at the highest safe speed, with military police at checkpoints ensuring they received absolute priority on all roads. As Thompson's convoy crossed into Belgium, the weather deteriorated rapidly. Snow reduced visibility to less than 50 yards, and temperatures plummeted to -10 degrees Celsius. The roads, already damaged by months of military traffic, became treacherous. Trucks slid into ditches. Radiators froze. Drivers worked in shifts of 4 hours on, 4 hours off, but many refused to relinquish their wheels, driving until exhaustion forced them to stop. "This ain't driving. This is praying with your hands on a wheel," Johnson muttered as his truck fishtailed around a particularly sharp curve. "Keep it between the ditches," Thompson replied from the lead vehicle. "Patton'S boys need what we're carrying more than they need excuses." On the third day of the offensive, Obersturmbannführer Schroeder received troubling reports from forward reconnaissance units. Despite the blizzard conditions, American supply trucks were arriving at forward depots in astonishing numbers. The expected logistical collapse wasn't materializing. "How many trucks?" Schroeder demanded of the motorcycle messenger who had just arrived. "Hundreds, Herr Obersturmbannführer. They travel in convoys of 30 to 50 vehicles around the clock. The Americans have crews clearing snow continuously." Schroeder dismissed the messenger and turned to Helmuth. "It seems the Americans are more resourceful than I anticipated. We must adjust our plans." He studied the map, focusing on the roadways. Here and here, he indicated 2 points where the supply routes passed through narrow valleys. "We'll deploy anti-tank units and artillery. If we can't stop their fighting men, we'll stop their supplies." The ambush was set for the following morning at a section of road near Bastogne, where the highway narrowed between steep embankments. 2 Panther tanks concealed among the trees would open fire first, followed by concentrated machine gun fire to eliminate survivors. German intelligence indicated that American truck drivers were primarily service troops, not combat soldiers, and would offer minimal resistance. Thompson's convoy approached the ambush point at dawn. The snow had momentarily stopped, though the sky remained leaden. In the lead truck, Thompson noticed something odd about the road ahead. Subtle disturbances in the snow pattern, tracks that didn't match civilian or American military vehicles. "Something's not right," he murmured. Next to him, Private First Class Wallace tensed, his hand moving to the M1 carbine secured between them. Thompson keyed his radio. "All vehicles, full stop. Maintain spacing." The convoy halted with military precision, engines idling. In his concealed position, Schroeder cursed. "They've spotted something. Open fire." The first Panther's 75mm shell screamed over the convoy, impacting the road behind the last truck. The German gunner, expecting the vehicles to be closer together, had misjudged the precise American spacing. Before he could reload, Thompson was already reacting. "Scatter and return fire," he shouted into the radio. The drivers, though primarily service troops, had all received basic combat training. More importantly, many had faced similar situations during the months of driving through contested territory. From the third truck in line, Corporal Johnson was already manning the .50 caliber machine gun mounted in the truck's ring. The heavy weapon chattered, sending tracers toward the muzzle flash of the German tank. He wasn't aiming to destroy the Panther. The heavy machine gun couldn't penetrate its armor, but to force the crew to button up, reducing their visibility and accuracy. Private Wallace leapt from Thompson's truck, carbine in hand, and began directing fire toward the German infantry positions. Suppressing fire, 3 o'clock, behind that fallen tree. What Schroeder had failed to appreciate was that the Red Ball Express drivers, after months of operation, had evolved from mere truck drivers into a hybrid force, logistics specialists with combat experience. Many convoys had adopted unofficial but effective security protocols after experiencing similar ambushes. Thompson grabbed the radio. "Convoy 7 to any Allied air support. We are under attack at coordinates Tango Romeo 375. German armor and infantry. Request immediate assistance." "This is Thunderbolt Squadron," came the immediate reply. "P-47's inbound. ETA 7 minutes. Can you mark your position?" "Affirmative," Thompson replied, reaching for the colored smoke grenades every lead driver now carried. The firefight continued for those 7 minutes, with the trucks using their mobility to prevent the Germans from concentrating fire. 2 trucks were hit and burning, but their drivers had escaped. The rest maintained a steady barrage, not to win the engagement, but to survive until help arrived. When the P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, the tide turned instantly. The fighter bombers, originally designed for escort missions but now excelling in ground attack roles, unleashed 500-pound bombs and .50 caliber strafing runs on the German positions. Within minutes, both Panthers were burning, and the German infantry were retreating in disarray. As the smoke cleared, Thompson regrouped the convoy. They had lost 3 men and 4 trucks. Painful losses, but far less than Schroeder had anticipated. More importantly, the bulk of their cargo, ammunition for Patton'S tanks and artillery, would reach its destination. "Let's roll," Thompson ordered. "We're already behind schedule." Schroeder, watching the American convoy continue its journey from his fallback position, felt a cold realization that had nothing to do with the winter air. The war had fundamentally changed, and perhaps Germany had lost it long before this moment. "Their truck drivers fight like infantry," he told Helmuth, "and their industrial capacity." He trailed off, recalling how quickly the destroyed trucks had been replaced in previous engagements. "How many vehicles does America manufacture each month?" "Intelligence reports indicate 47,000 trucks per month," Herr Obersturmbannführer, Helmuth replied quietly, "plus 8,000 tanks and 17,000 aircraft." The numbers were incomprehensible. The entire German Reich struggled to produce 1,500 tanks monthly. And here was just one element of America's logistics system, continuing to function in conditions that would have paralyzed German supply lines. As December progressed, the true scale of American logistical superiority became increasingly apparent. The reactivated Red Ball Express, operating around the clock, delivered an average of 12,500 tons of supplies daily to Patton's Third Army. This included 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, 500 tons of ammunition per day, 125 tons of medical supplies, 200 tons of food rations, countless spare parts, winter clothing, and equipment. These statistics represented more than numbers on paper. Each gallon of fuel meant another 5 miles a Sherman tank could advance. Each ton of ammunition represented the difference between holding a position or retreating. Each medical supply shipment saved American lives. While Thompson and his fellow drivers fought to maintain supply lines, General Patton's Third Army executed one of the most remarkable pivots in military history. In less than 72 hours, Patton rotated his entire army 90 degrees and launched an attack toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded but holding firm. When asked if this maneuver was possible, Patton had famously replied, "Hell, we're still fighting on interior lines. It's the Germans who have their backs to the wall." But Patton's confidence rested on the knowledge that his supply lines would hold. Without the Red Ball Express, the Third Army's tanks would have ground to a halt within days, out of fuel and ammunition. By December 22nd, Obersturmbannführer Schroeder's unit had been pushed back to defensive positions near Hofelice. The American counterattack was gaining momentum, and German fuel shortages were becoming critical. In stark contrast to the American situation, German panzers were being abandoned when they ran out of fuel. "Our fuel reserves are at 18% of required levels," Helmuth reported during their evening briefing. "We have ammunition for perhaps 3 more days of combat at current rates." Schroeder nodded grimly. "And the Americans?" "Continuing to receive supplies at unprecedented rates. Our air attacks on their convoys have been ineffective due to Allied air superiority. Their trucks now travel with fighter escort during daylight hours." The fundamental asymmetry of the war had never been clearer to Schroeder. Germany had superior tanks in the Tiger and Panther, better infantry weapons with the MG-42 machine gun and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, and still retained tactical excellence at the small unit level. But none of this mattered against an enemy that could simply replace losses faster than they occurred, whose supply lines seemed inexhaustible, and whose industrial base remained completely untouched by the war. As if underlining this point, Helmuth added, "Intelligence intercepts indicate the Americans are already replacing their losses. 300 new trucks arrived yesterday at Antwerp. They're manufacturing vehicles faster than we can destroy them." On Christmas Eve, as German forces began their slow retreat from the Bulge, Technical Sergeant Thompson's convoy completed its 15th consecutive day of operations. The men were exhausted beyond measure, surviving on catnaps and K-rations. Many had frostbite on their extremities, and all suffered from the bone-deep fatigue that comes from constant vigilance and physical exertion in extreme conditions. Yet when Thompson announced they would have a 4-hour maintenance halt for Christmas Eve, the reaction surprised him. "Begging your pardon, Sarge," Johnson said, "but I'd rather keep rolling. Boys at the front ain't getting no holiday. Neither should we." Around the temporary bivouac, heads nodded in agreement. These men, largely relegated to support roles due to the Army's segregation policies, had found their own way to fight. "All right then," Thompson conceded. "Maintenance checks, refuel, and we roll in 30 minutes. Next stop is 10th Armored Division Forward Depot." As they continued through the night, the convoy passed a column of German prisoners being marched to the rear. The captives, cold, defeated, and surprised to see black soldiers in American uniforms, stared as truck after truck rumbled past, each loaded with the supplies that had made their defeat inevitable. "They just now figuring it out," Johnson observed, nodding toward a German officer who was counting the trucks with visible dismay. "This ain't just an army they fighting. It's Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago all rolled into one." By the end of December, the tide had turned decisively. The German offensive had been contained and was being systematically reduced. Patton's Third Army had broken through to Bastogne on December 26th, and the German forces were being pushed back across the entire front. In his temporary headquarters, now located near Luxembourg, Obersturmbannführer Schroeder received the latest intelligence report with resignation rather than surprise. The American logistics system had not only survived the winter conditions and German attacks, but had actually increased its capacity. The report detailed 5,938 operational trucks in the Red Ball Express system, 23,000 drivers working in rotating shifts, 69 maintenance facilities operating 24 hours daily, 12 dedicated route clearance teams removing snow continuously. "They're not just winning the production war," Schroeder told Helmuth as he reviewed the figures. "They've created an entirely new form of warfare. Their logistics capabilities allow them to concentrate forces and supplies anywhere on the front within hours, completely negating our tactical advantages. Helmuth nodded silently. Both men were experienced enough soldiers to recognize the writing on the wall. Germany might continue fighting for months, perhaps even another year, but the outcome was now inevitable. As January 1945 dawned, the Red Ball Express completed its mission. The German Bulge had been eliminated, and conventional rail lines were being restored as territory was recaptured. The truck convoys that had saved Patton'S army began to be reassigned to other sectors. For Technical Sergeant Thompson and his men, there was little fanfare or recognition. They received no combat medals despite having repeatedly engaged the enemy. There were no newspaper headlines celebrating their contribution, despite the fact that their efforts had been crucial to the Allied victory in the Ardennes. On their final day of operations, Thompson gathered his drivers. "I know what you men did. I know what it cost. And someday, the whole world will know too." As the men dispersed to their reassigned units, Corporal Johnson lingered. "You think anybody back home will ever hear about what we did here, Sarge?" Thompson looked out at the now quiet highway that had been their battlefield. "Maybe not tomorrow, but someday they'll understand that wars aren't just won by the men who fire the guns. They're won by the men who deliver the bullets." In February 1945, Obersturmbannführer Werner Schroeder was captured during the Allied advance into Germany. As a senior SS officer, he expected harsh treatment. Instead, he found himself being interrogated by an American intelligence officer primarily interested in logistics. "You had tactical superiority in numerous engagements," the American major noted. "Your tanks were better, your infantry weapons superior. Yet you consistently lost. What?" Schroeder considered the question carefully. "We underestimated your ability to move and sustain forces," he finally answered. "When we destroyed one of your tanks, 3 more appeared the next day. When we blocked a road, your engineers cleared it within hours. When we thought winter would freeze your supply lines, your trucks kept coming through blizzards that would have stopped our own vehicles." He paused, then added, "We were fighting with a pre-war mindset. You were fighting with industrial might that redefined warfare itself. For every tank battle won by courage, 10 more are determined by fuel availability. For every position held by determined infantry, 100 are abandoned due to ammunition shortages." The American nodded, making notes. "And the Red Ball Express specifically? Your assessment?" "A triumph of organization over circumstances," Schroeder replied without hesitation. "We never believed you could maintain supply lines of that volume, in those conditions, under enemy fire. When we saw those trucks continuing to arrive despite everything we threw at them, that was when many of us knew the war was truly lost." The statistics of the Red Ball Express's achievement during the Battle of the Bulge remain staggering. 412,193 tons of supplies delivered, 7,183 vehicles maintained in operation, 6,967,840 gallons of fuel consumed by the transport fleet itself, 889 miles of routes kept open despite snow depths reaching 24 inches, average turnaround time of 59 hours for a complete circuit. Behind these numbers were countless stories of individual heroism that rarely made it into official reports. Private First Class Wallace, who had spotted the ambush with Thompson, had been a mechanic in civilian life, working at a small garage in rural Georgia. During one particularly brutal stretch of weather, when temperatures plunged to -15 degrees Celsius, Wallace performed emergency repairs on 17 different vehicles in a 24-hour period, working with bare hands in the snow because delicate mechanical adjustments couldn't be made with gloves on. By morning, his fingers were so severely frostbitten that the medics feared amputation might be necessary. Wallace refused evacuation. "These trucks don't run, those boys don't fight," he told the frustrated medical officer who tried to order him to the rear. "And those boys don't fight. This war don't end." The medics compromised, treating his hands as best they could while allowing him to remain with his unit. Wallace continued working, even though every touch of metal against his damaged skin brought excruciating pain. By the end of the campaign, he had personally returned 39 vehicles to service, equivalent to the capacity to transport 117 tons of supplies. Corporal Johnson's story was equally remarkable. Before the war, he had been not just a taxi driver, but an amateur mechanic with a passion for modifying engines for better performance. This knowledge proved invaluable when fuel shortages threatened operations in late December. Johnson developed a method to adjust the GMC engines for more efficient cold weather operation, reducing fuel consumption by nearly 7% while maintaining power output. The technique spread throughout the Red Ball units, saving an estimated 172,000 gallons of fuel during the critical 2-week period of the German offensive. "We're making do with what we got," Johnson explained when an engineering officer questioned how civilian taxi drivers had solved a problem that had puzzled military vehicle designers. "When you grow up having to make things work with whatever's available, you learn to see solutions others might miss." Staff Sergeant Robert Miller, commanding the maintenance section of Thompson's company, had been a high school science teacher from Philadelphia. His systematic approach to preventive maintenance, instituting a rigorous inspection schedule that prioritized electrical systems and fuel lines most vulnerable to extreme cold, reduced breakdown rates by 23% compared to other Red Ball units. When asked about his methods, Miller shrugged. "It's just applied physics and common sense," he said. "Cold shrinks metal and thickens oil. Water freezes and expands. If you understand the principles, you can anticipate the problems." This practical problem-solving extended beyond vehicle maintenance. When snow drifts repeatedly blocked a critical mountain pass near Bastogne, cutting off a key supply route, Master Sergeant Leroy Davis, a former construction worker from Chicago, devised an innovative solution. Using damaged truck tarps, tree branches, and scavenged building materials, his team constructed snow fences at strategic points along the route, redirecting the wind to prevent drift formation. The improvised barriers reduced road clearance time by 65%, keeping the supply lines open during the worst of the blizzards. For the men of the Red Ball Express, the winter campaign was as much a battle against nature as against the German army. Frostbite affected nearly 30% of drivers at some point during operations. Exhaustion-related accidents claimed almost as many lives as enemy action. Yet through it all, the convoys kept moving, maintaining a schedule that many military planners had deemed impossible. Perhaps most remarkable was their ability to adapt tactics in response to German attacks. When conventional routes became too predictable and vulnerable to ambush, Thompson and other convoy leaders began utilizing secondary roads, farm tracks, and even temporarily frozen streams to move supplies forward. They developed a rotation system where route patterns were never repeated on consecutive days, making it nearly impossible for German intelligence to predict convoy movements. The flexibility of this approach stood in stark contrast to the more rigid German logistics system, which relied heavily on rail lines and formally designated supply routes. As Schroeder later noted in his prisoner debriefing, the American supply system seemed to function as a living organism, adapting instantly to obstacles. Remove one route, and like water, they simply flowed around the obstruction. But perhaps the most revealing statistic was one compiled after the war. During the critical period of December 16 to 31, 1944, American forces in the Ardennes never fell below 75% of their required supply levels, even at the height of the German offensive and the worst of the winter weather. In contrast, German forces, despite shorter supply lines and fighting on interior lines, saw their supply levels drop to 38% of requirements by December 24 and to a critical 17% by December 31. For men like Technical Sergeant William Thompson, Corporal Marcus Johnson, and their fellow drivers, the war continued through Germany's surrender in May 1945. They returned to an America not yet ready to fully acknowledge their contribution to a society still divided by segregation and inequality. Many found their wartime experiences, where their competence and courage had been valued above all else, difficult to reconcile with civilian life in segregated America. Yet the lessons they had taught on the snow-covered roads of Belgium were not forgotten by military planners. In future conflicts, logistics would never again be treated as secondary to combat operations. The ability to deliver supplies, in any conditions, against any opposition, would be recognized as equally important to victory as the ability to fire weapons. As for Obersturmbannführer Werner Schroeder, his prediction proved both right and wrong. Patton's army hadn't frozen in the snow, it had advanced through it, powered by an industrial and logistical system that had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. The German officer who had once boasted of winter's advantage had learned that in modern war, no force of nature is as powerful as a nation's productive capacity fully mobilized. The story of the Red Ball Express during those crucial winter weeks of 1944 to 45 reveals a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Battles may be won by tactics, courage, and leadership, but wars are won by production lines, supply chains, and the determined men and women who keep them functioning against all odds. Their remarkable story stands as a powerful reminder that victory often depends on logistics as much as battlefield courage and tactical brilliance. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.